Alright, boys and girls, I got kind of an interesting video to show you. But before that, I beat Gary's mod. That's right, I got the high score. Okay, well, in the actual video, we're going to be talking about server tick lag. Server tick lag, that means there's kind of a lot of different kinds of lag, and we're not talking about ping lag, for example. Okay, Gary's mod is a real-time application. What that means is you want to have quite a few updates in a short amount of time. Let's just say in a second, right? So the typical servers that you play on if you're watching this video, so ACF, ACE, those servers are going to be 66 tick. So you can actually kind of figure out how long a tick should take at maximum before lag start happens. If you take 1000 milliseconds, because there are 1000 milliseconds in a second, and divide that by 66, you'd get about 15 milliseconds. It's okay, so whenever a server tick takes longer than 15 milliseconds, there will be lag. Now, not all lag is equal, because let's just say you take 20 milliseconds. 1000 divided by 20 is 50. So you go from 66 to 50. Probably won't be able to tell the difference if it's a consistent 50 anyway. So that's a lot better than if, I don't know, the server took like 500 milliseconds calculating just stuff. So that's a lot worse. That's about 2 ticks or 2 FPS for the server. So what's actually interesting is we do get some profile tools. If you in the console type net underscore graph, or you get this this graph right here. So I'm gonna try to use this black cube to highlight what I want you to focus on. Or the only number on that black cube is that 66. This is the server's current target tick rate. So that's gonna be in the top right. In the extreme bottom left, SV:150, this is the server's current tick rate. Now, these are gonna be the two numbers we use from the net graph for quite a few things. Alright, so on to the test environment. I feel like a true scientist now. So I am in single player. This is not a 2-player LAN server. And so my frame rate and the server's frame rate are effectively the same. So on a real server, these two numbers don't get linked. The server doesn't render stuff. It doesn't have to waste its time like on stuff like that. It's only interested in physics and whatever else has to be ran server side. So I believe I have some footage of just doing a quick test. I spawned the prop model of my Centurion in a garage. Frame rate was pretty horrible. However, the server's frame rate was basically fine. It's full tilt. It doesn't have to render all of those props. So another thing is I do have the multi-core rendering setting enabled. I don't think this has an effect on physics at all, but there's actually 3 settings to be interested in. One is, figure this out, GMOD M-core test. Now the guy wants you to set that to 1, and I believe the settings set this to 1 for me. So the next one is mat GMOD. Yeah, it wants you to set this to -1, and mine's already set to -1. Again, I think that's the setting. The difference here is CL_threaded bone setup. Supposed to be set to 1, I believe. However, just using the setting, this gets set to 0, and I'm not going to change it. So those are basically the settings I have. Okay, so we're almost ready to get started with some tests. So for the test, there will be 10 of these plates, and all of the plates will be welded together. If you're wondering why the plates will be welded together, that's because I want to keep all of the entities awake and not sleep. Another thing is all of the cubes will have their alpha set to 0. Because I am in single player, my frame rate and the server's frame rate are going to be interlinked. My frame rate dips, the server tick rate dips. So I don't want that contaminating the test data. So there's going to be 3 main tests. Technically there's more or less depending on which plate and what I felt like doing. The first test is grabbing all of the 10 plates and just moving them around in the air to see what happens. The next test is going to be just dragging it across the ground to measure the impact of performance. And the basically final test is to drag it along the ground on rougher terrain. So I believe there's another thing I wanted to mention. There are 70 of these little cubes. They aren't always going to be cubes or have cube collisions necessarily. But having 10 of these plates, you do the math, that's 700 constrained entities. So we're definitely doing a stress test here. And a final note is the physics iteration setting. The physics iterations for all of these tests will be at 10. What's interesting is that if you want to change the physics iterations, and this is for if you want to maybe follow along, maybe run your own tests, I don't think you can change it on the fly and have it actually update for the contraption you have spawned. I think you have to delete it and respawn it. Even if you froze all of these, it doesn't seem to take effect. Okay, so the first test is going to be with this weld-plate test. It uses these cubes, and the cubes don't have spherical collisions. The cubes also don't have any collisions at all, really. So, taking the entire assembly into the air and flinging it with like a high mouse scroll speed, the server's frame rate was low 40s to high 30s according to my notes. I'm reading this from notes, so this is gonna be kind of awkward. Leaving the assembly stationary in the air with a little bit of movement, the server's frame rate was close to the target tick rate of 66. So for the ground test, this one was kind of variable. So moving the assembly and letting the cubes touch the ground, the server's frame rate was about 30 for default no clip speed. Now when moving it at higher speed, so a sprint no clip speed, it seemed to be a lot more variable, but my estimate is about 20 for the server frame rate or tick rate. I'm going to use those interchangeably a lot. So something interesting happened when I was dragging these on the ground, and it came into contact with this rail right here. So when the assembly came into contact with the rail, the performance was horrible. And then I took the assembly to the rough ground course, and over here the performance was overall worse, but it was very variable. So I actually did this test again on 2 iterations. That first test was on 10. So this is the only time I actually bothered with 2 iterations, and overall it was identical. Okay, so after that weld plate, I then wanted to try giving the little cubes spherical collisions, just to see what would happen, if the performance would be better or worse. And according to my test notes, it just says identical. So, moving on. So I wanted to try yet another weld plate, not giving up easily. This time, rather than using spherical collisions, I'm using the default hitbox on these S-prop spheres. Overall, it's the same. On rough terrain, it was worse. And also on flat ground, if I forced the plates down, the performance was noticeably worse. So I'm currently editing the video right now, and I basically wanted to come back and show you the footage that I have of me forcing down. First, I'm going to show you now the cube collisions, forcing that down. And after that, I wanted to show you forcing down the spherical collisions. So these are cubes, but they have their collisions swapped to be spherical. Just as a source of a comparison between my claim of the sphere hitbox being worse. So I have yet another weld plate. So this one goes back to the cube weld plate, so no spherical collisions. However, that doesn't seem to matter because all of these have been parented to a gate on top of their respective plates. Doing this basically turns off collisions with the world automatically. I wasn't able to do ground testing with this because there's no collisions. So what's interesting about this is that the air test, moving these around at high speed, rolling the mouse back and forth, the performance was better. You can definitely tell all of the little cubes are there, just like by the way the whole thing moves around. But just having this thing moving around, it seems to be marginally better for performance. It's kind of like that idle behavior in the air if everything just has a little bit of velocity to it, but isn't like rapidly changing speed or anything. Okay, so the next test I wanted to run was the Ballsocket-plate. The cubes do have spherical collisions, and once again they don't have collisions. Okay, so the air tests for this one seem quite a bit better. Well, quite a bit in quotes. So rather than hanging around the low 40s when fizz gunning it violently forwards and backwards, this had the servers at, well, really my FPS. You can use my FPS as well since we're in a single player game. But either way, the frame rate was 50, around about 50. Okay, on flat ground at default no clip speed, dragging the assembly across the ground was actually really quite a bit better. Quoting in my notes, 40 to 50. The flat ground test at like a sprint no clip speed, so moving a bit faster. That was seemingly better again compared to the weld. Now this still has problems when it comes into contact with these rails here. And on rough ground, just next door, it actually, according to my notes, had the best performance. Relatively speaking, it's still worse than if this thing was on flat ground though. Alright, so this one is the most interesting. This is the sus plate. So for suspension, of course. That's not an Among Us joke, honest. Each cube has spherical collisions and has their collisions disabled. They also have 2 rigid ropes each, an elastic, and an advanced ball socket. This is really meant to test constraint count and also complexity at the same time. Perhaps a horrible test, but get on to the results. So already with the air test, it is worse. So the whole assembly was hanging around the high 30s compared to the weld test, which tended to hang around like mid to low 40s. Now the flat ground test was pretty interesting. The actual behavior was pretty spiky, so things I noticed: changing the velocity, so any sudden acceleration from not fizz gunning it to fizz gunning it yielded really bad performance. However, when there's like a stabilizing behavior, so when it's stabilized, then you get better performance, and I'd say slightly higher than dragging a weld plate across the ground. This is at, I want to say, default no clip speeds. So this plate, or this assembly I should say, there's 10 of them. Really horrible performance when it came into contact with the rails. On rough ground, this had the worst performance. I want to say this was like occasionally getting into the single digits, just like dropping it and let it roll. And I think actually this is where we start to deviate. So I tried removing the advanced ball sockets to see if giving the wheels freedom to rotate in any direction would help with the lag. That didn't help. Performance was still just as horrible. I then removed the ropes, so we go from 4 to 3 with the ball socket being removed, and we go from 3 to just 1, just the elastic that's present. This also had no effect. Once again, we're deviating from the test to see almost like what's causing it, but either way that just leaves the elastics, and with just the elastics, this thing still ran horribly on the rough terrain. Okay, I then wanted to test what would happen if the cubes, so cube hitbox, so not made spherical, came into, we're constantly in contact with something else other than the ground. So this is another weld plate actually, and there's a plate that's basically a little bit inside the cubes by default to just ensure they're colliding, and I do not have full test data on this one. Reason being is because my game cannot handle a single one of these. So actually the behavior is kind of inconsistent, but in either case this thing can probably crash my game. What I mean is, I'm talking about iterations. It's, I want to say, easier to trigger this thing when iterations is at 10. However, it's harder when iterations are lower. I only tried with basically 1 or 2, one of those. A surefire way to trigger it either way is to let the thing rest on the ground and grab the plate that is in contact with the cubes. When this thing does whatever it does, just a single one of these brings my frame rate all the way down to 2. Well, actually 1. I believe the tick rate goes to 2, indicating that it's clamped to 2. So it's actually lower than what it's reporting. So I do not have any full tests with 10 of these things because I can't run a test with just 1 of these things. Alright, so as I wrap up here, I should have mentioned this first, but just having 10 of the base plates welded together, my frame rate was basically at the cap. I'm running an external cap of 150, I guess. I want to say this because the parented weld cube test did the best. That was basically almost at the physics tick target. However, that was still lower than if the cubes didn't exist, basically. Well, parenting isn't free necessarily, but it's probably the best by a little bit, depending on what you're doing. I do have ideas for other tests that you could possibly do, and I could possibly do them at a later date, or someone else can. I'm not gonna do them today, or anytime soon for that matter. So I tested Ballsocket. I did not do an axis test. What happens if the wheels are free to rotate only on one axis? That constant collision plate Generally, I'm terrified of messing around with that, but what if instead of the cube collisions, they had spherical collisions? That could be a good test. Testing elastic only properly could be a good one. And also going in again and trying multiple elastics per little cube. So maybe 1, 2, and maybe 4. And finally, to properly test constraint count, might be a good idea to lock these little cubes in place using rigid ropes. It's almost like a rigid rope ball socket, but maybe 3 or 6 or 9 rigid ropes. Maybe 3 is just fine. So those are a few test ideas that I didn't do that could possibly get more information from. I believe that's going to be the end of the physics segment. So the physics side of things, we ran tests and it was definitely the longer part of this video, probably. Now we're gonna take a look at basically scripted entity effects on server tick lag. So for this example, I'm gonna be using expression 2. However, you can also take a look at starfall and again other scripted entities. So the reason this segment is going to be so incredibly short is that execution time, or I should say chip execution time, the impact of that on server tick lag is very, very predictable. Now remember, on 66 tick servers, so the servers we normally play on, whenever you take longer than about 15.15 repeating decimal milliseconds, there will be server lag. A millisecond is equivalent to 1,000 microseconds. So we seem to be chilling at around 13 to 14,000 microseconds, which is 13 to 14 milliseconds. So if I add more of these E2s, there will be lag. Kind of all over the place. I think I'm gonna need more to, show you that there is lag, because again, going from 15 milliseconds to even 20 milliseconds, you might not notice the lag. I want to say now we're at 18 of these E2s and there is definitely some lag going on. It's always very predictable when scripted entities start lagging the server. Now, scripted entities might not be the sole reason the server's lagging. So physics and these chip execution time are actually additive. So if I were to have half of these expression 2s and half sus plates, let's say 5 sus plates, maybe like 9 of these, the server would still be lagging, even though I could have 5 of these E2s just fine, or maybe like 10 of them just fine. While we're talking about this, I wanted to mention starfall is actually pretty promising for like having a server do less things in general, is for the ability to have client-side operations, but it would help overall take some stress away from the server. Again, just a shout out to starfall and like a thing it can do, basically. Alright, so now I'll try to wrap this thing up. There's actually quite a bit that goes into contraption cost as far as the server is concerned. So I guess we can talk about the physics first. It's not a really great way to determine the physical cost of a contraption, other than just by spawning a bunch of it. It would be nice if there was more profiling tools for stuff like that. Maybe I'm looking a gift horse in the mouth. So based on the testing, the physical plates, seems to be that collisions are the most costly thing. Like whenever something comes into contact with the ground, or the ground did something else in the case of the nuke plate, as I call it, the server does not have a good time. The same thing generally does, or actually always does, a lot better if it's just in the air, even if it's being fizz gunned around. And I guess we can mention, yeah, constraint parenting, if you absolutely do not need collisions with anything, is good. One thing I have in my notes is that constraint count doesn't seem to have an impact on performance, so just having the sus plate in the air, even how bad the elastics, I'm gonna say the elastics were behaving, was still a lot better than having it come into contact with the ground. That seemed to be where it really had an effect. So actually, advice from this, definitely try to avoid unintended collisions. So for example, I know friction gearboxes is something you might do if you have a prop engine. I'm not saying don't use friction gearboxes, that's ridiculous. But unintentional collisions. By default, whenever I spawned wire component on something else, I'm pretty sure it gets a weld, and I believe there's an option to disable collision. Either way, this E2 didn't spawn with collisions. That's good. But if you were to, let's just say, position your engine on your base plate, or ACF AC, and weld it down, definitely disable the collisions. Mine's actually parented, so it doesn't matter if the collisions are on and off, on or off. And definitely in the case of the wheels, don't want to have these things accidentally colliding with each other as much as possible. However, maybe disabling collisions on these isn't the best idea either, because you won't be able to go over prop bridges then. And then again, it depends on you if you care for that kind of thing or not. But definitely, if you're gonna disable collisions, definitely consider parenting rather than having something to sort of be free to move around even if it's welded. That'll be better than constraint parenting. But constraint parenting is better than just a constraint, let's say, even if you remove collisions. Alright, so for chip execution time, this one's pretty simple actually. Lower is better. If you absolutely wanted to know what kind of budget should I have, like per contraption, I would actually say it depends on the contraption. Like if you have a super tank, you have, generally speaking, a higher budget than, like, I don't know, a swarm tank, something that there's supposed to be lots of. But I would say you can basically do 15,000 divided by your average chip execution time under load, so not when idling like here. So 15,000 divided by, let's just say 1,000 average chip execution time. That will give you 15. Now depending on your physical structure, you would actually have to subtract a bit off the top, because remember, chip execution time and the physical structure are additive as far as how much time it's going to take for the server to process it. Another word on the profiler. Looking at the profile as the sole means of determining what is causing server lag is not correct. However, the profiler isn't completely useless, because if the server is lagging and you can see the total expression 2 usage anyway, you can't profile starfall chips as far as I'm aware. If you compare that to, I guess, let's just say our point 15 milliseconds or 15,000 microseconds thereabouts. If the total chip usage is less than 15,000 microseconds and the server is lagging, you have to basically determine the ratio. Is the server lagging mostly because of physics or mostly because of chips? Still useful for determining what kind of server lag. So this, along with the net graph 4, probably the best we're gonna get. Otherwise, closing thoughts. Hopefully, and I know this is copium to say, but we don't have any sort of witch hunting going on because of any of the information here. And hopefully there are other people who run their own tests. But yeah, this is definitely going to be my entry for checking out server tick lag, basically. So that's the video. Hopefully this was useful to you, and I'll see you around.